1943, Washington, D.C. A 6'2" woman who can't cook stands in a bathtub, stirring a foul-smelling mixture of copper acetate and black dye with a wooden spoon. Her name is Julia McWilliams. She's not a chemist. She's not a scientist. She's a typist who joined the OSS hoping for adventure. But this recipe she's mixing, later called her first big recipe, will save thousands of American lives, protect secret underwater explosives from curious sharks, stay in military use for 30 years, and possibly even protect NASA astronauts during splashdown. Years later, as Julia Child, the most famous chef in America, she'll laugh and say, "I could boil water for tea, but my first big recipe was shark repellent." This is the bizarre, true story of how a woman who couldn't cook accidentally became a military innovator, and how a kitchen hack mixed in a bathtub became the Navy's secret weapon against one of the ocean's deadliest predators. Julia Carolyn McWilliams was born on August 15th, 1912, in Pasadena, California, into a wealthy and socially prominent family. Her father, John McWilliams Jr., was a landowner and investor. Her mother, Julia Carolyn Weston, came from old New England stock. Young Julia grew up privileged, athletic, and remarkably tall. By adulthood, she stood 6 feet 2 inches, an extraordinary height for a woman in the 1930s, a characteristic that would significantly affect her life trajectory. She attended Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, one of America's premier women's colleges, graduating in 1934 with a degree in history. Julia was athletic and social, playing tennis, golf, and basketball. She was popular, energetic, and adventurous, but showed absolutely no interest in cooking. In fact, she was notably incompetent in the kitchen. This wasn't unusual for a woman of her social class. Wealthy families employed cooks, and young women from Julia's background weren't expected to prepare their own meals. After graduating, Julia moved to New York City, working in advertising for the W&J Sloan Furniture Company. She wrote advertising copy, designed layouts, and learned the basics of persuasive communication. The work was acceptable, but not fulfilling. Julia wanted something more meaningful, more adventurous, more important than selling furniture to affluent New Yorkers. She just didn't know what that something was. When World War II began after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Julia immediately wanted to serve her country. At 29 years old, she was physically fit, energetic, educated, and eager to contribute to the war effort. She applied to join the Women's Army Corps, WWII, the women's branch of the U.S. Army. They rejected her. Her height exceeded the maximum allowed for female military personnel. The military had strict physical standards, and 6'2" women simply didn't fit into standard uniforms, equipment, or quarters designed for much smaller individuals. Julia then applied to the WWII, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, the U.S. Navy's Women's Auxiliary. They also rejected her for the same reason, too tall. The rejection was frustrating and demoralizing. Here was an able-bodied, educated woman, desperate to serve her country, turned away because of something she couldn't control. But Julia was persistent, a character trait that would define her entire life. If the military wouldn't take her, she would find another way to serve. In 1942, she learned about the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency and precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The OSS had been created in June 1942 under the direction of William Wild Bill Donovan to conduct espionage, sabotage, and intelligence operations behind enemy lines. Unlike the conventional military, the OSS was more flexible about personnel standards. They needed smart, capable people for a wide variety of roles, many of them administrative or analytical rather than operational. Height restrictions weren't as rigid. Julia applied to the OSS and was accepted. Finally, she had found an organization willing to use her talents, regardless of her unusual stature. She was assigned to the OSS headquarters in Washington, D.C., and began work in August 1942 as a junior clerk typist in the Office of War Information. Her job was mundane, typing names on index cards and filing them in massive card catalogues. It was tedious clerical work, far from the adventure she had imagined, but it was a start. She was serving her country, contributing to the war effort. Even if her contribution seemed small, Julia's supervisors quickly recognized that her education, intelligence, and energy were being wasted on simple filing tasks. She had a college degree from Smith, experience in advertising, and obvious administrative capability. Within months, she was promoted to junior research assistant working directly for Colonel William J. Donovan, the OSS director himself. This was a significant jump, putting her at the center of America's intelligence operations during the most critical war in history. Julia's real adventure was about to begin. In early 1942, American military forces faced an unexpected and psychologically devastating problem: sharks. As the war expanded across the Pacific Ocean and Atlantic, thousands of American sailors and airmen found themselves vulnerable in the water after ship sinkings, aircraft crashes, or forced ocean landings. And sharks were attacking them. The actual statistics weren't as terrifying as the perception. By July 1942, approximately 20 American naval officers had been confirmed killed or injured by shark attacks since the war began. Given the tens of thousands of sailors and airmen operating over oceans, this was a relatively small number. Drowning, exposure, dehydration, and enemy action killed far more people than sharks. But the human mind doesn't process risk rationally. The idea of being eaten alive by a shark was psychologically devastating in a way that other wartime dangers weren't. The media amplified the fear. Newspapers and magazines published lurid accounts of shark attacks, often exaggerating details or inventing specifics to create more dramatic stories. Sailors read these accounts and developed intense anxiety about water operations. Morale suffered significantly. Some servicemen became so fearful of sharks that they hesitated during emergency water evacuations or refused to abandon sinking ships until absolutely necessary, sometimes dying as a result. The psychological impact was far greater than the actual casualty numbers warranted. There was also a practical military problem beyond human casualties. The Navy was deploying underwater explosives, mines, and other submerged equipment in defensive patterns around strategic locations. Sharks, curious and attracted to electromagnetic fields and vibrations, would sometimes investigate these devices and accidentally trigger them. Expensive explosives designed to destroy enemy submarines were being detonated by curious sharks. This was both wasteful and dangerous, as premature detonations could injure friendly forces and create gaps in defensive minefields. In July 1942, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military planning body in the United States, formally requested that the Office of Strategic Services develop a shark repellent. This wasn't just about saving individual lives, though that was important. It was about maintaining troop morale, preventing waste of expensive military equipment, and solving a problem that was affecting military operations across multiple theaters of war. The OSS director, General Donovan, recognized that shark repellent development was actually a broader problem of rescue equipment and survival gear. Sailors and airmen needed many types of emergency equipment: life rafts, survival rations, signaling devices, first aid supplies, water purification systems, and yes, shark repellent. Rather than having multiple agencies duplicate efforts, Donovan proposed coordinating all rescue equipment research under a single OSS office. Thus was created the Emergency Rescue Equipment, ERE, section within the OSS. The ERE was headed by Captain Harold J. Coolidge, a scientist from Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology, and Dr. Henry Field, curator of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. Both men were experienced explorers and naturalists who had led expeditions into Arctic regions, deserts, and tropical environments. They understood survival in hostile conditions and brought scientific rigor to the problem of keeping servicemen alive in emergency situations. The ERE needed staff. Coolidge and Field required research assistants, administrative coordinators, and people to manage the various projects under development. Julia McWilliams, the tall former advertising copywriter who had proven herself capable as a research assistant, was assigned to work for Coolidge in 1943 as his executive assistant. Her official title was bureaucratic and boring, but the actual work would prove fascinating. Julia was about to become involved in one of the war's strangest and most publicized military research projects, teaching sharks to stay away from people by making them think dead sharks were nearby. The emergency rescue equipment section faced a daunting scientific challenge. Find a chemical compound that would deter sharks from attacking humans, yet be safe for humans to carry deployable in ocean water. Effective for several hours, compact enough to attach to life jackets or survival gear, producible in large quantities with wartime manufacturing limitations, and above all, actually work when a desperate sailor or airman needed it most. The team began by researching what was already known about shark behavior and deterrence. The existing scientific literature was limited. Sharks were poorly understood animals in the 1940s. Marine biology was a relatively young field, and most research focused on commercially important fish species rather than predatory sharks. There were theories, folk wisdom, and anecdotal reports, but little rigorous scientific data about what actually deterred sharks from attacking. One piece of traditional knowledge stood out. Sharks seemed to avoid areas where other sharks had died. Fishermen and native cultures in shark-populated regions had observed that the presence of dead or decaying shark carcasses appeared to repel living sharks. This made biological sense. Many predators avoid areas with dead members of their own species, as death might indicate disease, poison, or other dangers. If the ERE could identify the chemical compound that created this avoidance response, they might be able to synthesize it in a form suitable for military use. But there was an obvious problem with the traditional approach. Requiring sailors to carry decomposing shark carcasses strapped to their bodies would be unacceptable. The smell alone would be unbearable in the close quarters of ships or aircraft. The practical problems of preserving, storing, and deploying actual dead sharks made the approach impossible for military use. The team needed to identify what specific chemicals in decaying sharks caused the repellent effect, then find a way to produce those chemicals synthetically. The researchers began systematic testing. Over the course of 1942 and 1943, they tested over 100 different substances. They tried extracts from decaying shark meat, attempting to isolate the specific compounds sharks found repellent. They tested organic acids, which might mimic decay products. They experimented with various metals and metallic salts, exploring whether sharks responded to certain chemical tastes or electrical properties in water. The testing was methodical, scientific, and often disgusting. Some substances showed promise in laboratory tests, but proved impractical for field use. Others worked in controlled conditions, but failed when tested in actual ocean environments with live sharks. Many compounds that effectively deterred sharks were too dangerous for humans to handle or too environmentally destructive to use in large quantities. Finding something that met all the requirements proved extraordinarily difficult. One category of compounds emerged as particularly promising: copper salts. Specifically, copper acetate and copper sulfate showed consistent ability to deter sharks in laboratory conditions. In tests where bait was treated with copper acetate solution, sharks showed obvious avoidance behavior. They would approach the bait, detect the copper, and swim away without attacking. The effect wasn't perfect. Some particularly aggressive or hungry sharks would still attack treated bait, but the success rate was around 60% in controlled tests. far better than anything else the researchers had tried. Copper acetate had additional advantages. It was relatively safe for humans to handle. It dissolved readily in water. It could be produced in quantity using existing industrial processes, and it was stable for storage. The chemical wasn't ideal, but it was the best option the ERE had found after months of systematic testing. Now the challenge was developing a practical delivery system that would allow servicemen to deploy the copper acetate effectively when they needed it, while keeping it safely contained until deployment. Julia McWilliams became directly involved in the shark repellent project. During her year as Captain Coolidge's executive assistant in 1943, her role wasn't primarily scientific. She wasn't a chemist or marine biologist, but rather coordinating the various aspects of the project, managing communications between researchers, procurement offices and military units, testing prototypes, and ensuring that the development process moved forward efficiently despite wartime resource constraints and bureaucratic obstacles. But Julia also participated, hands-on in the practical work of creating the actual repellent product. The ERE had determined that copper acetate was the most effective chemical deterrent, but they needed to develop a delivery system. Pure copper acetate in powder form wouldn't work. It would disperse too quickly in water, providing only momentary protection. The team needed a formulation that would release the chemical gradually over several hours, creating a protective zone around a person in the water. The solution was to bind the copper acetate in a solid cake, similar to a bar of soap that would slowly dissolve in water, releasing the chemical gradually. But the cake needed additional components. First, a black dye was added. Sharks are visual hunters, and experiments suggested that dark-colored objects were less likely to attract initial attention than bright or contrasting colors. The black dye would make the repellent less visible in water and potentially reduce the likelihood of attracting sharks in the first place. Second, the copper acetate and dye needed a binding agent that would hold the cake together during storage, but dissolve predictably in seawater. Various waxes and other compounds were tested. The formulation had to remain solid in hot aircraft cockpits and ship storage areas, but dissolve readily when submerged in ocean water of various temperatures. Finding the right balance required considerable experimentation. This is where Julia's famous bathtub mixing comes in. In her own words, years later, "I could boil water for tea, but my first big recipe was shark repellent that I mixed in a bathtub for the Navy, for the men who might get caught in the water." The bathtub mixing wasn't just colorful detail. It was necessary. The quantities being produced for testing and initial deployment were too large for laboratory beakers and flasks, but too small for industrial mixing equipment. Bathtubs provided convenient, appropriately sized vessels for mixing prototype batches of the repellent compound. Julia, along with other ERE staff, would carefully measure copper acetate powder, add the black dye compound, add the binding wax, and mix everything together using large spoons or paddles, just like mixing a giant batch of cake batter. The comparison to cooking wasn't accidental. The process really was similar to following a recipe, measuring ingredients, mixing them in proper sequence, achieving correct consistency. For someone who couldn't cook, Julia was developing skills that would later prove surprisingly relevant to her actual cooking career. The mixed compound was then formed into small disc-shaped cakes, about 3 inches in diameter and half an inch thick. These cakes were placed into small waterproof boxes with metal screen openings. The box could be attached to a life jacket, belt, or strapped to a person's leg or arm. When submerged in water, the screen allowed water to reach the cake, which would begin slowly dissolving and releasing copper acetate and dye into the surrounding water. The design was simple, practical, and required no complex activation mechanism that might fail in emergency conditions. The resulting product was officially designated Shark Chaser. The name was optimistic, marketing as much as accurate description, but it captured the product's intended purpose and helped with troop morale. When issued to servicemen, Shark Chaser came with instructions, but the core message was simple. If you end up in the water, activate this device, and sharks will be less likely to attack you. The psychological benefit was immediate and substantial, even if the actual effectiveness remained somewhat uncertain. The scientific testing of Shark Chaser revealed both promising results and significant limitations. In controlled experiments conducted by the ERE and Navy researchers, copper acetate showed approximately 60% effectiveness in deterring sharks from attacking test bait. This meant that in 6 out of 10 trials, sharks would avoid bait treated with copper acetate solution while they readily attacked untreated bait. That success rate was substantial, but far from perfect. Field testing under actual ocean conditions proved more challenging. Sharks, in their natural environment, behave differently than sharks in controlled experimental settings. Variables like water temperature, salinity, current strength, shark species, hunger level of individual sharks, and presence of other prey all affected results. Some field tests showed excellent effectiveness, with sharks clearly avoiding areas where Shark Chaser had been deployed. The tests showed minimal effect, with sharks attacking despite the presence of copper acetate. The ERE conducted tests with various shark species, since different types of sharks might respond differently to chemical deterrents. Great white sharks, tiger sharks, bull sharks, and various smaller species were tested when possible. The results suggested that copper acetate deterred most species to some degree, but no species was completely deterred 100% of the time. Some individual sharks, particularly those that were very hungry or aggressive, would attack despite the chemical presence. A significant limitation emerged during testing. Shark Chaser was completely ineffective against barracudas and piranhas. These predatory fish showed no avoidance behavior when encountering copper acetate. For servicemen operating in waters where these species were present, particularly in tropical regions where barracudas were common, Shark Chaser provided no protection. The ERE documented this limitation clearly in their reports, but the military proceeded with deployment anyway, reasoning that partial protection was better than none. Another practical limitation involved deployment conditions. Shark Chaser worked by creating a protective zone of copper acetate-saturated water around a person. But ocean currents would disperse this zone over time. In calm waters, a single Shark Chaser cake could maintain an effective protective zone for 6 to 7 hours, the estimated duration it provided before completely dissolving. In rough seas or strong currents, the protective zone would disperse much faster, reducing effectiveness to perhaps 3 or 4 hours. After the cake fully dissolved, no protection remained. The military also conducted morale surveys to determine the psychological impact of issuing Shark Chaser to personnel. The results were overwhelmingly positive. Even servicemen who understood that Shark Chaser wasn't perfectly effective reported feeling substantially less anxious about water operations when they knew they had some form of shark deterrent available. The psychological benefit far exceeded the actual statistical protection the device provided. This created an interesting ethical and practical question. Should the military issue a device that was partially effective but created disproportionate psychological benefit? Some argued that giving servicemen false confidence about shark protection was dangerous, potentially encouraging riskier behavior in the water. Others argued that the morale benefit alone justified deployment, especially since the device did provide real protection in many cases. Even if that protection wasn't absolute, the military chose widespread deployment. Starting in 1944, the War Department began issuing Shark Chaser to sailors and pilots, particularly those operating in Pacific and Atlantic theaters, where shark encounters were most likely. The distribution was accompanied by educational materials explaining sharks, shark behavior, and realistic expectations about deterrent effectiveness. The Navy even created a training guide called Shark Sense in March 1944. filled with facts about sharks, advice on behavior in shark-infested waters, and cartoons illustrating key points in the military's characteristic style of using humor to convey serious information. Requests for shark chaser poured in from the Army Air Corps and Coast Guard as well as the Navy. By 1945, the device was standard issue in survival equipment for thousands of servicemen. Whether Shark Chaser actually saved many lives from shark attacks remains difficult to prove statistically, but it unquestionably saved lives by improving morale and reducing panic-driven poor decisions during emergency water situations. While the Shark Chaser project proceeded toward military deployment, Julia McWilliams' OSS career expanded beyond the emergency rescue equipment section. In 1943, after her year working for Captain Coolidge, Julia received new assignments that took her far from Washington, D.C., and placed her at the center of intelligence operations in Asia. Julia was transferred to Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, to work in the OSS registry. Essentially, the classified document management system for all OSS operations in the region. This was a position of considerable responsibility and trust. Registry officers had access to virtually all classified information passing through the station, as they were responsible for cataloging, storing, retrieving, and ensuring proper security of secret documents. Julia's reliability and organizational skills had evidently impressed her superiors enough to warrant this high-security assignment. In Ceylon, Julia encountered a much different environment than Washington headquarters. She lived and worked in tropical conditions, learned to navigate complex multinational intelligence operations. Ceylon was a British colony, and OSS operations there required close coordination with British intelligence, and experienced the war's reality much more directly than she had in the relatively safe American capital. Japanese forces controlled much of Asia, and Ceylon itself had been bombed by Japanese aircraft earlier in the war. It was also in Ceylon that Julia's life changed forever in a way completely unrelated to intelligence work. She met Paul Cushing-Child, a fellow OSS officer stationed in the region. Paul was 10 years older than Julia, sophisticated, worldly, and passionate about art, literature, and most importantly, food. He had lived in France, spoke French fluently, and had developed a deep appreciation for French cuisine. Unlike Julia, who had no interest in cooking and survived on simple food, Paul viewed meals as important cultural and aesthetic experiences. Paul and Julia began spending time together, initially as colleagues and friends, gradually developing romantic feelings. Paul introduced Julia to the concept that food could be something beyond mere sustenance, that cooking and eating could be creative, pleasurable activities worthy of attention and care. This was a revolutionary concept for Julia, who had always viewed food functionally rather than aesthetically. She didn't yet start cooking herself. That transformation would come later, but Paul planted the seeds of interest that would eventually define her life's work. In late 1944, Julia was transferred again, this time to Kunming, China, a strategic OSS station supporting operations in the China-Burma-India theater. She was promoted to Chief of the OSS Registry in Kunming, another significant increase in responsibility. Julia managed the classified document system for one of the OSS's most important stations during a critical phase of the war against Japan. She received the emblem of meritorious civilian service for her work in Kunming, a significant recognition of her contributions to the intelligence effort. Throughout these assignments, Julia maintained correspondence with colleagues from the Emergency Rescue Equipment section, including Betty McIntosh, a fellow OSS officer who would later write about OSS women in her book Sisterhood of Spies. In interviews decades later with McIntosh, Julia recalled her ERE work with fondness. "I must say we had lots of fun. We designed rescue kits and other agent paraphernalia. I understand the shark repellent we developed is being used today for downed space equipment, strapped around it so the sharks won't Attack when it lands in the ocean. Julia's claim about NASA using shark repellent for space equipment landing in oceans is difficult to confirm with documentary evidence, but it reflects an interesting possibility. Early spacecraft did land in oceans, and protecting expensive equipment from curious marine life would have been a legitimate concern. Whether NASA actually used the OSS shark repellent formula remains uncertain, but Julia's comment demonstrates her pride in the work she had done years earlier for the military. When World War II ended in August 1945, Julia McWilliams faced the same question millions of veterans and war workers faced. What comes next? The OSS was being dissolved. It would officially shut down in October 1945, and Julia's government employment was ending. She was 33 years old, had spent 3 years working in intelligence, and had no clear direction for her post-war life. Paul Child proposed marriage, and Julia accepted. They married in September 1946, and Julia became Julia Child, the name by which the world would eventually know her. More importantly for Julia's future, Paul's post-war career with the U.S. Foreign Service would take them to France in 1948. Paul was assigned to the U.S. Information Service in Paris as an exhibitions officer, responsible for cultural programs promoting American interests in France. For Julia, arriving in France was a revelation. She and Paul ate at La Couronne, a restaurant in Rouen, where Julia tasted sole meunière, fresh Dover sole, lightly flour-dredged and sautéed in butter, accompanied by white wine and fresh bread. Julia later described this meal as a moment of profound awakening. For the first time in her life, she understood what Paul had been trying to explain about food. It could be transcendent, beautiful, meaningful beyond mere nutrition. Julia decided to learn French cooking. At age 36, with no cooking experience beyond stirring shark repellent in bathtubs, she enrolled in the famous Cordon Bleu cooking school in Paris. This was extraordinary for several reasons. First, she was significantly older than most culinary students, who typically began training in their late teens or early 20s. Second, she was American in an intensely French culinary culture that viewed French technique as superior to all others. Third, she was a woman entering a profession that, despite its domestic associations, was largely male-dominated at the professional level. The Cordon Bleu initially placed Julia in a class designed for American housewives learning basic cooking. Julia immediately recognized this was inadequate for her ambitions. She wanted professional-level training, the same rigorous education French chefs received. She insisted on transferring to the professional track, where she was often the only woman among male students who had been cooking since childhood. The challenges were substantial, but Julia thrived on challenge. Just as she had taught herself intelligence work through determination and practice, she now taught herself to cook through the same approach. Julia spent years mastering French technique. She studied under master chefs, practiced endlessly, and developed the methodical approach to cooking that would later characterize her teaching style. She met Simone Beck and Louisette Bertholle, two French women working on a French cookbook for Americans, and joined their project. This collaboration eventually became Mastering the Art of French Cooking, published in 1961. The book that would transform Julia's life and American cooking culture. The book was revolutionary. Previous French cookbooks available in America either assumed professional-level knowledge that home cooks didn't possess, or oversimplified French technique so much that the results bore little resemblance to authentic French cuisine. Julia's contribution was detailed, methodical instruction that assumed no prior knowledge but taught real French technique step by step. She applied the same systematic approach she had used at the OSS, break complex problems into manageable steps. Document everything clearly, test procedures repeatedly until they work reliably. Explain not just what to do, but why it works. Mastering the Art of French Cooking was initially difficult to publish. Multiple publishers rejected it as too long, too detailed, too specialized. But when Alfred A. Knopf finally published it in 1961, the book became an unexpected bestseller. American home cooks, particularly educated women with time and resources, embraced the opportunity to learn authentic French cooking. The book's success led to a television appearance in 1962, which led to the French Chef television series, which led to Julia Child becoming the most famous cooking instructor in America. The French Chef premiered on Boston public television station WGBH in 1963. The show was revolutionary in multiple ways. First, it was entirely unscripted. Julia cooked in real time, narrating her process as she worked, making mistakes on camera and showing how to recover from them. This was radically different from the scripted, heavily edited cooking shows that preceded it. Julia's approach was honest. Cooking involves errors, and learning to correct mistakes is as important as learning to avoid them in the first place. Second, Julia's on-camera personality was unlike anything American television had seen. She was tall, gangly, enthusiastic, and spoke in a distinctive, warbling voice that became instantly recognizable and frequently parodied. But rather than trying to appear professionally polished, Julia embraced her quirks. She dropped things, said, "Oh dear," when something went wrong, and laughed at her own mistakes. She made cooking seem accessible rather than intimidating, fun rather than stressful. Third, Julia taught real technique rather than simplified approximations. She showed viewers how to properly bone a duck, make puff pastry from scratch, or prepare complex sauces. These weren't quick 30-minute weeknight dinners. They were serious cooking projects that required time, attention, and practice. But Julia made them seem achievable. Her message was consistent. With proper instruction and practice, anyone can cook at this level. You don't need natural talent. You need good technique and willingness to practice. The French Chef ran for 10 years and won a Peabody Award and an Emmy Award. Julia became a cultural icon, recognized everywhere, parodied on Saturday Night Live, famously by Dan Aykroyd, and referenced constantly in popular culture. She published additional cookbooks, appeared as a guest on numerous television programs, and became the public face of French cuisine in America. Her impact on American cooking culture was immeasurable. She legitimized home cooking as a worthwhile pursuit for educated adults, popularized fresh ingredients and proper technique, and helped transform American dining habits. But Julia never forgot her origins in the OSS and her work on shark repellent. When interviewed about her wartime service, she spoke fondly about the experience. In various interviews over the years, Julia would mention her first big recipe and laugh about mixing shark repellent in bathtubs. She saw continuity between her wartime work and her cooking career. Both involved following systematic procedures, measuring ingredients carefully, testing results, and solving practical problems through methodical experimentation. Julia's OSS service wasn't publicly known until 2008, when the National Archives released thousands of previously classified documents about OSS personnel. The revelation that America's most famous chef had worked in intelligence during World War II generated significant media coverage. Articles with headlines like "Julia Child Secret Agent" and "Before she was a chef, she was a spy" appeared in newspapers and magazines. The story fascinated people because it revealed an unexpected side of a beloved public figure. The shark repellent connection particularly captured public imagination. The image of 6'2" Julia Child stirring foul-smelling chemical compounds in a bathtub had comedic appeal. But it also illustrated an important historical point. World War II required contributions from people with all kinds of skills and backgrounds. Julia wasn't a trained scientist or chemist, but her organizational skills, willingness to learn, and practical approach to problem-solving made valuable contributions to the war effort. The military innovation wasn't just about brilliant scientists making breakthrough discoveries. It was also about competent people doing unglamorous work that collectively added up to victory. Julia Child died on August 13, 2004. 2 days before her 92nd birthday at her home in Montecito, California. Her obituaries celebrated her culinary legacy, but also mentioned her OSS service and shark repellent work. The unlikely combination of spy and chef, shark deterrent and French cuisine typified Julia's unconventional life trajectory. She had transformed herself multiple times, from wealthy California girl to OSS intelligence officer to legendary cooking instructor, proving that people can reinvent themselves at any age if they're willing to learn and work. Hard modern marine biology has provided more sophisticated understanding of shark behavior and chemical deterrence than was available to the OSS Emergency Rescue Equipment section in the 1940s. Contemporary research validates some aspects of the original shark chaser concept while revealing why it was less effective than hoped. Sharks do respond to chemical cues in water. They have extraordinarily sensitive olfactory systems capable of detecting minute concentrations of blood, amino acids, and other organic compounds from great distances. This sensitivity extends to many types of chemicals, not just food-related odors. The OSS researchers were correct that chemical deterrence could theoretically work by exploiting sharks' reliance on chemical detection. Research published in the early 2000s identified specific compounds that sharks release when injured or stressed. These alarm pheromones signal danger to other sharks, causing avoidance behavior. Scientists successfully synthesized some of these compounds and demonstrated their effectiveness in controlled tests with multiple shark species. This confirms the basic principle behind shark chaser. Sharks can be deterred by specific chemicals associated with danger or death of their own species. However, the OSS researchers' choice of copper acetate was less than optimal. While copper compounds do have some deterrent effect, they're not the specific alarm pheromones sharks naturally respond to. Copper acetate works partially, which explains shark chasers' 60% effectiveness rate in tests, but more precisely targeted compounds could achieve higher success rates. Modern shark repellents use different chemical formulations based on contemporary understanding of shark neurobiology and chemical communication. The black dye component of shark chaser also reflects partial understanding. Sharks do use vision in hunting, and contrast attracts attention. Dark coloration can reduce visual conspicuousness in certain conditions. However, sharks primarily use electroreception and vibration detection rather than vision when locating prey. The black dye's benefit was probably minimal compared to the chemical deterrent effect of the copper acetate. Current shark repellent technology uses multiple approaches. Chemical repellents based on synthesized alarm pheromones show promise but face the same limitations as shark chaser. They require continuous deployment, wash away in currents, and eventually dissipate. Electromagnetic devices that interfere with sharks' electroreception sense have shown effectiveness in some tests but don't work on all shark species. Acoustic deterrents that produce sounds sharks associate with danger are being researched. Visual deterrents using patterns that mimic dangerous marine animals show mixed results. Interestingly, the most effective shark attack prevention remains behavioral. Avoid swimming in areas and times when sharks hunt. Don't wear shiny jewelry or high-contrast clothing that attracts attention. Don't swim with open wounds that leak blood, and avoid erratic movements that mimic distressed prey. These simple behavioral modifications reduce attack probability more effectively than any technological deterrent yet developed. The Navy stopped issuing shark chaser in the 1970s, not because it was proven ineffective, but because improved search and rescue capabilities reduced the time survivors spent in the water. Helicopters, improved emergency locator beacons, and better coordination of rescue operations meant that downed pilots and sailors were typically recovered within hours rather than days. The scenarios where shark chaser might have provided benefit, long-term survival in shark-infested waters, became increasingly rare as rescue technology improved. Nevertheless, Shark Chaser remained in some survival kits well into the 1980s. Approximately 40 years after Julia Child mixed the first batches in Washington bathtubs. Its longevity in military inventory testified to the psychological benefit it provided, even if its chemical effectiveness was limited. Servicemen felt more confident with shark deterrent available, and that confidence translated into better decision-making during emergencies. Julia's claim about NASA using shark repellent for space equipment has some basis in historical fact. Early spacecraft did splash down in oceans, and protecting expensive equipment from marine life was a legitimate concern. However, documentation definitively proving NASA used the OSS shark repellent formula remains elusive. What is documented is that NASA developed its own shark deterrent procedures for astronaut recovery, including use of dye markers to help locate astronauts visually, flotation devices, and rapid helicopter recovery protocols specifically designed to minimize time in the water where sharks might be present. Modern understanding reveals that the shark threat to WWII servicemen was probably overstated, though genuine in specific circumstances. Statistical analysis of wartime casualties shows that actual shark attack deaths were relatively rare compared to drowning, exposure, and enemy action. But fear is not always rational, and the psychological impact of shark anxiety was real regardless of statistical risk. From that perspective, Shark Chaser succeeded at its most important mission, giving servicemen confidence to operate effectively in ocean environments. Julia Child's connection to shark repellent became one of those delightful biographical details that humanizes historical figures and reminds us that interesting people often have unexpected backgrounds. The woman who taught millions of Americans to cook had once worked in military intelligence, mixing chemical compounds to deter predators. The juxtaposition is amusing, but it also illustrates important truths about innovation, service, and personal growth. First, wartime innovation often comes from unexpected sources. Julia wasn't a marine biologist, chemist, or shark expert. She was an administrative coordinator who happened to be in the right place at the right time, working with people who needed practical help solving a pressing problem. Her contribution wasn't theoretical brilliance, but practical assistance, mixing, testing, coordinating, helping transform a chemical concept into a deployable product. Wars are won not just by genius inventors, but by competent people doing unglamorous work that collectively enables victory. Second, Julia's trajectory from OSS officer to celebrity chef demonstrates that career paths aren't always linear or predictable. At 33, with the war ending, Julia had no plan to become a chef. She couldn't cook. She had no culinary training. The idea that she would become the most famous cooking instructor in America would have seemed absurd. But circumstances, marrying Paul, moving to France, tasting Sol Meunière, opened possibilities she hadn't imagined. Her willingness to start learning at 36, when most professional chefs had already trained for decades, showed remarkable courage and determination. Third, skills transfer across different domains. Julia's systematic approach to intelligence work, breaking complex problems into steps, documenting procedures, testing methods, explaining clearly, translated directly to teaching cooking. Her methodical style wasn't natural talent, but learned skill developed through her OSS experience. When she taught viewers how to bone a chicken or make hollandaise sauce, she applied the same analytical approach she had used managing classified documents in Ceylon and China. The shark repellent story also highlights how collaborative efforts create innovations. Julia always acknowledged that shark repellent wasn't her invention alone. It was developed by teams of researchers, chemists, and coordinators working together under ERE leadership. Julia's role was important, but not uniquely decisive. She mixed, coordinated, and facilitated, but didn't invent the chemical formula or design the deployment system. This honest acknowledgement of collaborative contribution stands in contrast to many innovation stories that lionize individual lone genius. Inventors Julia's public references to shark repellent work also demonstrated healthy perspective about fame and accomplishment. She could have hidden her OSS background, focusing exclusively on her culinary achievements. Instead, she spoke openly about it, treating her wartime service as important, even though it wasn't what made her famous. She understood that her contribution to the war effort, while small in the grand scheme, was genuine service worth acknowledging. This humility and perspective made her even more beloved by audiences who appreciated her down-to-earth authenticity. The phrase, "My first big recipe was shark repellent," became one of Julia's most famous quotes, appearing in countless articles and books about her life. It perfectly captured her ability to find humor in unexpected places and connect disparate aspects of her experience. Yes, it's absurd that a future chef's first recipe was a chemical deterrent mixed in bathtubs. But it's also true, and the truth is often stranger and more interesting than fiction. Today, Julia Child is remembered primarily for transforming American cooking culture, popularizing French cuisine, and proving that good cooking is achievable for anyone willing to learn proper technique. But she should also be remembered as a woman who served her country during its greatest crisis, contributing practical skills to the war effort in ways she couldn't have anticipated would someday connect to her later fame. The shark repellent work was a minor footnote in the vast story of World War II, but it was real contribution to a real problem, made by a real person who happened to later become famous for something entirely different. In the end, Julia Child's shark repellent work reminds us that everyone has unexpected dimensions, that people contain multitudes, that the path from A to B is rarely straight, and that sometimes the most fascinating stories are the ones we discover only after someone becomes famous for entirely different reasons. Before she taught America to cook, Julia Child taught sharks to stay away. Both contributions made the world slightly better, which is all any of us can hope to accomplish.